Spinosaurus, an original post-apocalyptic story by Peyton Strange, read for you by the author. How it happened, no one knew, and yet it didn't matter. Somehow the dinosaurs had reappeared. Somehow they had simply returned, born again from an unseen anomaly that couldn't be explained by science. And it wasn't just dinosaurs. It was every form of extinct life, prehistoric or modern, plants as well as animals. As the anomaly spread like a virus, human civilization was slowly overwhelmed and it collapsed. The natural order of things was then thrown into chaos as a free-for-all for survival between all species began. Dinosaurs suddenly hunted unprepared modern animals. Prehistoric trees the size of weeds tried to compete with massive redwoods that blocked much of the sun from reaching the ground. And humans faced an apocalypse on a scale unlike anything their species had seen since the Ice Age, if such a comparison was even fair. Some species that had become extinct once reappeared and vanished back into extinction again, along with some modern-day species that could not survive in such a world. What was left was a mix of all of the life forms that had ever lived on the planet. Ancient and modern animals now lived side by side. The Earth had witnessed its sixth mass extinction event, though it was unlike anything that anyone had predicted. It wasn't the climate, it wasn't pollution, it wasn't overhunting. It was simply an unexplainable anomaly. This story begins just before this unstable period and then follows what happened next. In a world overrun with dinosaurs, can humanity survive with them and itself? Or are we doomed to the extinction by the claws of the previously extinct? Prelude, Nick's Journal. This story began on the unassuming day that I found an egg in the forest while out on a hike. It was just sitting on an old rotting log, alone, and almost seemed to have simply materialized there. During the following days, I tried to find out what had laid the egg. But after a few days of research, the only thing that I found was that there was nothing anywhere in western Ohio, or all of Ohio, that laid eggs as big as the one that I'd found. Not even eagles laid eggs that big. After checking in on it for several days and seeing no change around it at all, I decided that it was abandoned and I took it home. I was simply too curious at that point to just forget about the whole thing. I wanted to see what would hatch from it. When it hatched, not a very long time afterward at all, it turned out that there was a reason the whole thing seemed so strange. What hatched out of that egg was a real baby dinosaur. Specifically, the hatchling was a Spinosaurus. I realized that before the end of the world as we once knew it happened, that this news I'm delivering would have been earth-shattering. Guess I'm just used to him and dinosaurs as a whole now. Like everyone else still alive in this post-apocalyptic world of chaos that we all live in now. I named him, the hatchling, Spino. I know, I'm very creative with names. He became my best friend. I raised him, and he spent his first year living in my house. But when he grew too big, he had to move outside. From then on, he lived in the woods just behind my house. Though this almost didn't happen at all. Now, I don't think that my first thought was to raise the little prehistoric carnivore as if he were a puppy. When I first realized what had hatched from that egg, I panicked. Personally, I think it was a reasonable reaction to seeing a living dinosaur. I didn't want any part of keeping and raising a dinosaur, or any part in whatever voodoo was going on, and had gone to my garage to get a hatchet, intending on killing the dinosaur before it grew big enough to eat me. Then I was going to bury my head in the sand and forget this whole thing ever happened. But when I had gone back to my living room, where he had hatched, I saw the baby looking at me with large eyes, radiating nothing but trust, love, and curiosity. That look, that adorable little look, was enough to make me stop. It sounds rather cliche, but it's true. And from that day on, I was suddenly a father. I still feel like an ass, though, whenever I think about what I almost did. When Spino had grown into a full adult, I did tell him about it. He didn't take it well, but understood my reaction, and thinking about it from my point of view, and after a tense week, where we kept our distance from one another, we both made peace with the fact of what I'd nearly done. Yes, he understood me when I told him. I found out very quickly that he was not exactly what you'd think of as a normal dinosaur. He was an enigma, within a situation that was already an enigma, and I'll explain why once I add a little more context about my life with him. When I was home from university and wasn't studying for my degree in advanced animal biology, I would spend all of my time with Spino. Being an introvert ever since an early age, I found socializing with the dinosaur, who doesn't judge me, much easier than spending my time hanging out with humans that do. It was like how your beloved dog never judged you, though in my situation, the beloved sidekick could actually understand me. And dinosaur or not, Spino was perfectly safe to be around. You see, Spino wasn't what you would call a normal dinosaur, not even a normal member of his respective species. Aside from the whole being around in our modern age thing, he didn't have the eel-like tail that we know Spinosaurus had, and he was bigger than any known Spinosaurus fossils were. He walked upright, on his powerful hind legs most of the time, but was also perfectly comfortable dropping down and walking on all fours. In addition, he seemed to have a much stronger bite force than a Spinosaurus was thought to have. Also, the big guy was smart. And since I want this to be a full record of where things started and where they are now, I'll go into a little further detail. He could talk. As you know, based on what we all saw when civilization collapsed, there were rare exceptions of reborn prehistoric life that, for reasons we still don't know, could talk. They also had the same imaginative, high-powered brains that people do. Spino happened to be one of those rare examples. Spino lived in my house for about the first year. Despite college taking up the majority of my time, I was still able to raise him. Since I lived alone in the country, in a large forest that I think was state-owned land before, the company Spino provided me was genuinely nice, and some of my favorite memories were from that point in time. I remember the first time Spino heard thunder. He'd practically torn the blankets on my bed apart as he tried to bury himself under the covers next to me. It couldn't have been more of an opposite to the time that I first let him swim in the pool on my back deck. It was one of those nice underground pools, and he zipped around under the water for hours. He had no interest in sitting with me at all for that entire day. I had to put a leash on him and get him to come back inside when it started getting dark. I remember another time, I think Spino was around 4 months old and about the size of a chocolate lab, when he jumped up on my kitchen island, at which I was sitting, and begged me to let him try my coffee. After a few seconds of begging, he must have decided that I was taking too long to answer, because he just stuck his snout right into my mug and took a big slobbery drink. He made a huge mess. Though, let me just say, a hyper baby Spinosaurus getting a caffeine high was one of the funniest things I have ever seen in my life. He really was my best friend, and the only living thing that had ever been in my life that I'd give the honor of calling my family. So putting the hatchet back where I grabbed it from on the day that he hatched was the best thing I'd ever done. After remembering all of this, I'm gonna have to give him a treat now just to show how much I appreciate him. He loves a good chin scratch and almost acts like a giant dog, talking murderous dog with a sail on his back when I give him a treat. Not a characteristic you might expect from such a large dinosaur, but it's strangely adorable. On top of that, Spino had a very openly blunt personality. If he wanted to say something, then he would. Once he had grown too big and had to move out of my house and into the forest, at about a year old, I'd visit him every day. We loved spending time together out there, especially when we'd explore far and wide. I have many more fun memories from that time, finding all manner of interesting things deep in those woods. You could find waterfalls, abandoned buildings, caves, and all sorts of interesting things in those hills and trees. Living where I did meant keeping his existence under the world's radar was also relatively easy, not that he had a desire for the world to know about him. But now that you have an idea of who I am and who Spino, my large, fun loving, adopted dinosaur son, is, I'll start talking about how things went wrong. First, I do want to add that one other activity we both enjoy is stargazing. Spino didn't, and still doesn't, fully understand what a galaxy is, but that doesn't bother him. All he cared about was that the night sky was beautiful, and the nights that it was fully visible were his favorite period to be awake. On nights like this, he would just look at it for hours. I'd always point out various stars, planets, and galaxies to him, and tell him what they were specifically. Spino's eyes, while stargazing with me, were always so bright. They twinkled with curiosity. Spino always searched out galaxies in the night sky, the Milky Way, Andromeda, more distant neighbors, orbiting dwarf galaxies, or things much closer to home like the moon. To him, it didn't matter. They all fascinate him. Me, I always end up trying to spot Jupiter, mostly because its moon Europa is what always deeply fascinated me, what made my mind wander. Although, with how things are in the world now, sadly, I'll never live to learn if life is actually there. As a kid, I'd actually dreamed about being the first human to step foot on that frozen moon and finding what alien life swam in its hidden ocean. But it's likely no one will ever leave this planet again. Humanity was born here, and we'll all die here as well. Like everything before us. It's a rather poetic truth. And as a kid, I too had similar bright eyes when stargazing that Spino now has when he looks up into the deep void of space. I might still have that sparkle today too, who knows. This is just a quick little additional note, but I felt it was worth mentioning and I'd forgotten to add it before. It was over 2 years after Spino hatched that I first started seeing signs that something was not right. The apocalypse really had a slow burn, building up over a few years before the fuse that destroyed civilization over a few months was ignited. Dinosaurs and other extinct animals went from extinct to rare to overwhelming human civilization and sent the world into unstable anarchy. I have a lot to cover, so in all probability, my journal will span multiple entries. Since I'm only recording key events, I'm going to try to keep it short and just hit the main points, which still leaves much to tell. The morning the anarchy had started began perfectly normal. I'd finished my morning coffee, listened to an updated report about a new serial killer operating in the Ohio River region, and had just stepped out of my house onto the back porch near my pool, only to be snatched up in one of Spino's large, clawed hands. He had been waiting just outside of my door. His demeanor was odd, and he didn't respond to my questions. So I just let him carry me to wherever he was going. I mean, can you argue with a Spinosaurus if it wants to take you somewhere? Another thing I noticed at the time that caused me to just let it happen was his body language. It was strangely urgent in a way I hadn't seen before. Primal, maybe. Eventually, after he carried me a fair way off into the forest, he set me down and I saw what was affecting him. Let me quickly interrupt here for a moment because I want to add that this record might be inaccurate in a few spots. I'm writing all of this from memory, and it's been roughly a year since the main events I'm writing came to their conclusion, and even longer since the events I'm reviewing now occurred. Yes, I realize I had forgotten to mention that. I suppose I didn't think the information was needed at the time. I'll try to keep any further interruption to a minimum. Again, I want this to be as clear, as comprehensive, and as complete as possible. Going off memory, here is what happened next, as well as what happened over the next few months. Remember what I already said, I'm only focusing on the big events, for the most part. So, what was it that had affected Spino so much? A set of dinosaur tracks. A set of dinosaur tracks that he hadn't left behind. They were big, too. I was hunting here last night, Spino had explained to me as I examined them, and found this trail. I tracked it here, but it crossed the stream and I lost the scent. I remember that when I looked on the other side of the stream, the forest was much denser and looked rather foreboding. We decided to cross and explore. Another dinosaur being in the area was worth investigating. As I said before, I was able to keep Spino a secret from the world easily enough, because I didn't want to risk him being exploited by opportunists. I do not want to deal with the red tape that would inevitably come from such a revelation. Nor did I feel confident people could manage the wide revelation of a dinosaur being alive. But would a second dinosaur cooperate with that agreement? That kind of relationship? Was it even my responsibility at all? Did it even matter? Spino willingly went along with being kept a secret. Again, he had no desire to go anywhere that wasn't with me, nor did he want to be subjected to the kind of attention he'd receive were he revealed. If another dinosaur was suddenly in our world as well, then surely it was inevitable that people would find out, whether if it cared if they did or not. Those were my questions, among many others. Before we could answer any of them, we'd have to find it, whatever the new arrival was. Upstream, the water was shallow and fast-flowing, but in the spot where we stood, it was much deeper. So I had to climb up onto Spino's back, and then he waded across. Once we got to the opposite bank, I then jumped off of Spino and moved to the tree line, telling him I'd look ahead and that he could catch up once he was able to push through the tightly packed trees. I vividly remember Spino not liking the idea, but I went ahead anyway. Though I do admit, I was nervous about pushing ahead alone, but my curiosity got the best of me in the moment. After shoving my way through the trees, I realized what a bad move I had made. It just embarrasses me now as to how blind to danger I was back then. I found myself in a clearing, and sleeping in the center of it was, as expected from the tracks it left, another dinosaur. Now, at the time, that was earth-shattering, tracks or not. Little did I know that finding the dinosaur was just the precursor to what would come in the next months. The dinosaur in question was a large, thinly feathered Tyrannosaurus rex. Without a doubt, seeing that creature was the single biggest, oh shit, moment I've ever had in my life. It seemed impossible, despite the fact I saw a living dinosaur every day, that I was looking at an actual Tyrannosaurus. That dinosaur was something that a human should not be able to behold. A fearsome force of brutal power and strength unlike any other that had ever lived. A force from which humans were supposed to be safely separated from by over 60 million years. The dinosaur was a huge, fully grown adult, a bull. I knew enough about Tyrannosaurus that it was definitely a fully grown specimen based on the size, but it was not big enough to be a female. My less than silent entry into the clearing had awakened it. Its eyes were gazing right at me. I remember that predatory look with searing accuracy. They were the type of eyes you see on the monster in your nightmares. There was no deeper emotion or thought like with Spino. There was just hungry instinct behind those pupils. Those menacing eyes are burned into my brain and are forever in my nightmares. T-Rex stood up, realizing easy prey was in the clearing, and roared. It was a giant, hungry dinosaur, and I'd walked right up to it. I might as well have rung the dinner bell, rubbed seasoning all over myself, and laid down on a silver platter for it. As the Tyrannosaurus stalked towards me, I had confirmed what its eyes had told me already. This one definitely could not talk. You might ask why I didn't run. Well, you see, when someone is in a situation like I was, their brain chooses either flight or fight, but it can get stuck between them, and when it does, you just freeze up. That's what happened to me. I froze on the spot, and just as I was about to be breakfast for a T-Rex, the trees to my left were smashed. Spino, he pulled himself into the clearing, shoving past the last trees, then reared up on his tall hind legs and roared. The Rex turned to face him and roared in response, stalking towards Spino with powerful confidence. The Rex charged without pause towards the new threat, and there the standoff ended. I watched Spino drop onto all fours with a thunderous boom, then dodge to the side, avoiding the Rex's attack. In return, he had swiped at its head with his arms, and one of the swipes struck the Rex's left eye. The T-Rex roared again as its eye was gouged out of its skull in a gory mess. Shaking its head in response to the pain, Spino then went for its throat. Spino was trying to do was blind the Rex so it couldn't stop his following attacks or make use of its powerful jaws. The Rex saw Spino coming and dodged his bite, and instead, it was the one to bite onto Spino's neck. Spino kept his footing and slashed its other eye out with those large claws growing out of the tips of his fingers, and tore himself free from the bite, though not without receiving some deep, bloody puncture wounds from the Rex's teeth. I remember just standing still, frozen between fight and flight, as I watched Spino as he then dropped onto all fours again and jumped upwards with a powerful lunge from his legs, biting the Rex's neck from below. He pushed up and kept pushing until the Rex stumbled, and the motion of its falling, combined with how Spino was holding it, caused its neck to audibly snap. Spino opened his jaws and the limp corpse dropped to the ground with a thunderous boom. That thundering crash that it had made upon hitting the ground was something you have to hear with your own ears to be able to understand. I could never describe it accurately with words. I can only say the force was so physically vivid and its power so overwhelming that I stumbled a little bit as the ground shook while shockwaves blasted through it. And there was silence, and I remember it just as vividly as the boom. Not even a stray summer songbird was singing away in the surrounding trees. It was like the modern animals couldn't understand what show they'd just been witness to. A bear might have been the largest animal the birds and deer around here had ever seen, not these giant, towering behemoths from well over 60 million years in the past. After the fight was done and I regained my footing, I unfroze at last and quickly walked over to Spino to make sure that he was okay. Thankfully, he was just fine. He let me check his wounds, and none were life-threatening. So we then turned our attention to the Rex and examined it. Its teeth were still bared in a snarl, and its eyes were blank but glassy. After several minutes of taking in the impossible, I looked at Spino and asked, "How is it here?" Spino's reply simply had been, "I don't know." What we learned that day was that Spino was not the only dinosaur reborn from extinction. Another dinosaur had reappeared. What had been an incredible and fun mystery had turned ominous. Two anomalies were impossible. Spino told me we shouldn't let it worry us just yet, to which I had reluctantly agreed, and so we just went back home, confused, but alive. Things didn't get any better for the next few months. Assessing the situation now, I can say that the fall of civilization occurred mostly over the winter months. The collapse more or less spreading eastward from the west coast, though I didn't truly see any of it happen living in the isolated area I was at the time. I remember one of the earliest things I did see on the wilder scale of things was a video that blew up on the internet after being uploaded. It showed a whale watching ship called the Summer Air, full of eager tourists, suddenly be crushed and sunk when a Thalatorchon, a giant species of aquatic reptile that had been the dominant predator of the mid-Triassic era oceans, leapt from the water and down onto the boat. As horrible as it was, I couldn't help but think later on that it would have at least been a little ironic if it had been a Basilosaurus that had done the deed instead. Dark humor must have helped me with coping, especially in situations where you couldn't understand what the hell was happening. The coping mechanism, at least, helped me. Another video I saw around that time, shortly before winter, was a video someone had taken while out hiking in a national park. The video showed a pterodactyl flying over the people who were hiking, paying them no mind as it passed over them and continued flying on to wherever it was going. Though, of course, the video was very low quality and heavily pixelated, as videos like that always tend to be. You know what it was like at the time? It was like the Earth wanted humans gone and her prehistoric life back again. If I was the Earth, I can't say I wouldn't wish the same. This incident was one of the worst of those early months. It was around midnight when something within myself just made me wake up. Some sixth sense that picked up on that something was amiss. The house was dark. I never slept with the lights on. I'd never even done that as a kid, and I just had a feeling of danger being nearby. It was too quiet, even for a house in the middle of the night. I just knew that something was off. I left my bed and walked into the hall, hearing nothing but the sound of distant thunder. Occasional flashes of lightning through the windows were my only source of light. Wincing every time a floorboard creaked, I went down to the hall and entered the kitchen. Slowly, though, poking my head around the corner first before stepping in fully. Silence was almost overpowering. The sound of something moving made me stop. The center of my kitchen was the island countertop, and along with a flash of lightning, I saw that the kitchen window was busted and lay scattered on the floor. I still don't know how I didn't hear that, because I've never been a deep sleeper. And just poking out from the other side of the island was a mangled, bloodied, dead raccoon. I had only just seen it when it was suddenly, violently yanked back behind the counter, and I then heard chewing, bones snapping, and swallowing. Wide-eyed, I silently threw myself to the floor and ducked behind my side of the island. I heard something large stand up, still chewing its claws, ticking the floor. I heard sniffing coming around my side of the island, and I slid along the floor to stay on the opposite side of whatever the thing in my house was. The sniffing stopped, and I clearly heard it chittering softly. The sound is still as clear in my mind as it was on that night. Then there was just silence. Until I heard the countertop creak as a massive weight was applied to it. The thing had climbed up onto the island, was likely scanning the room. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room and cast a shadow on the wall. It was apparent to me what the animal was. It was a Utah raptor. It had to be, because no other known raptor species was so large. I heard claws tapping the countertop as it sniffed through. Risking a glance up, I saw it practically standing above me, one of its large toe claws inches above my head, slightly wrapped around the top of the counter. If it would have happened to glance down right then, it would have seen me. Not wanting to breathe, I pressed back against the island, trying to think of what my next move would be. I had no way to fight a Utah raptor. If you've never seen one, I envy you. But if you have, you know just how big they are. The only thing that I could do was try to get away and buy time until I thought of something. Well, it looked down before I could think of anything. It roared at me, and I scrambled to my feet, taking off down the hallway I'd come from. I remember I heard it land on the floor and begin to chase me. I knew I would not make it to my bedroom, so I ducked out of the hallway and into the living room, where I threw myself behind the couch. I then listened as the dinosaur ran in and stopped in the doorway. It began sniffing to try to find me. I knew hiding where I was wouldn't work. I didn't need it to. What I did need was for the dinosaur to leave the entrance way. Moved close. I took my chance and sprang past it, practically between its legs. I think it was startled. It was likely confused at my sudden movement, and it didn't chase me right away. In fact, I was back in the hallway and running towards my bedroom before I heard it shriek and begin to follow me again. Those few seconds were what saved me, because the raptor had just gotten back into the hallway as I slammed my bedroom door shut. It banged on the door, scratched at it a few times, and roared loudly, and began to throw itself against the wood. I knew I only had a few seconds, so I went to the window and looked out. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, so I didn't want to jump. As I was trying to decide what to do, the Utah raptor broke through my door and stalked inside the room, looking like the monster adults always promise their kids isn't under their beds. Even in the dark, I was able to see the outline of feathers, claws, and teeth just waiting inside my bedroom doorway. Not having a choice, I climbed out of the window and up onto the roof, feeling the wind created by the dinosaur's snapping jaws as it snapped by my feet. The rain made the siding slick, but I was able to reach the gutter and climb onto the roof with difficulty. Unfortunately, the raptor followed me. Jumping out of the window and latching onto the overhang as I had, it pulled itself up just as I rolled away from the edge. Soaked from the rain, I scampered across the roof and stood upright at the opposite end of the roof from the dinosaur. We were both soaked by the rain, and if anything, the raptor looked more frightening with wet feathers drooping along its body. With every flash of lightning, I caught a glimpse of the raptor's gleaming teeth and those large toe claws I'd heard tapping on the counter. The raptor began to climb towards me on all fours, using the claws on its hands and feet to grip the roof. "Oh, come on," I remember saying as I looked around. Spotting my pool, though it was a bit far, I knew it was the only place I could go. The pool was just inside of jumping distance if I backed up towards the raptor and sprinted before jumping, which is what I did. Somehow I avoided slipping and nearly ended up close enough to the raptor for it to swipe its claws at me. I landed in the pool on my back, causing a massive splash upon impact that knocked the wind out of myself. This stunned me for a moment, but I recovered after a short time and swam to the edge of the pool, where I climbed out quickly and then sprinted into the forest. I did not look back once. I just focused my attention on navigating through the forest and not on what was behind me. I found Spino quickly, woke him up, and told him what had just happened. He decided on the spot that from then on he'd be sleeping just outside my house and not in the forest. I spent that night cold and wet out in the forest, not getting another second of sleep. And first thing the following morning, Spino and I went back to my house. I watched from the tree line as he sniffed around my house until he finally told me that it was empty and the Utah raptor was gone. We decided that same morning it would be a good idea to search for the raptor. We searched for a full week, but we never found anything. The raptor had vanished like a ghost. Thankfully, that was the last big thing to happen for a while, so this section of my journal will be a record of journal events that occurred over a period of weeks. Simply ones that I feel are worth mentioning for one reason or another. While we were searching for the Utah raptor, we'd come across another dinosaur species, a baryonyx. It was milling around a small waterfall and natural pool. Spino and I stayed away, just observing it. The baryonyx had a partner, which came out of the trees and added some sticks to what looked like a tangled mess of brush on the ground with white rocks inside. It took me a second to realize that they were eggs. It was a mated pair, and they, and likely other dinosaurs as well, were reproducing. The implications of that were disconcerting. Summer turned to fall slowly as the months passed, and I kept up with the news about what had been happening. My university had long since put all classes on indefinite suspension, and the fall semester never even began. One day, as the leaves were just beginning to fall from the trees and form a blanket on the ground, I made a discovery with Spino while we were on our walk. It was a large skin that had been shed. Specifically, a large shed snake skin. It had to be a titanoboa skin. That was what made me first begin to look for things other than just dinosaurs roaming around. And it wasn't just carnivores roaming the earth again, despite what I'd personally seen. I'd seen videos of herbivores as well. I remember this one that went viral after being uploaded. It showed a triceratops attacking and pushing a semi off the road in the Mojave Desert somewhere. In the background, you could clearly see the cars swerving this way and that to avoid falling victim to the prehistoric power of the raging dinosaur. The weather was first beginning to turn cold when I was personally witness to another in-person show of prehistoric power. Spino was at my side, but not a player in this like he had been with the Tyrannosaur. We had been just sitting on a riverbank out in the forest as the sun had begun to drop low in the sky, when a Stegosaurus had sauntered into view on the opposite side of the bank from the left. It was just doing its thing, moseying on by without even a glance in our direction, when something else stalked towards it from the right. A Ceratosaurus, or a horn nose, as Spino called it. They met and sized each other up for a moment before the carnivore had gone right for the Stegosaurus's neck. You always imagined what a fight between two dinosaurs might have been like, but actually seeing one from an impartial perspective, unlike with the Rex Spino had fought, was impossible to describe. It was just two primal forces going at it, indifferent to you while you observed. It was better than any painting or movie ever showed. I saw something that was practically mythical come to life. I've seen a lot of things that seem mythical come to life since this all started. The fight ended with the Stegosaurus stabbing the horn nose in the stomach several times with the spikes on its tail, which drove the Carnosaurus away. Though the Stegosaurus did die shortly after, having received too many injuries. I thought it had survived, but when Spino and I had walked past the spot the next day, we saw that it was dead on the riverbank. The body was untouched, so the Ceratosaurus never came back to feed on it, so it might have died too. I felt that this particular story deserved its own section instead of being lumped in with the rest. It was my encounter with a Tyrannosaurus that, though I never heard it speak, I knew it could talk. I remember that my mind had been wandering that morning. I was already able to tell that the world was about to change. It was as if the planet had decided to go back in time, millions of years. By the time this happened, winter had set in and snow was covering the ground in a white blanket. That particular day, I needed time alone. My breaking point had been when I heard one too many terrible stories on the radio. The big report was that a safe zone in Italy, set up right outside the ruins of Pompeii, had been destroyed. The nearby volcano had erupted. I don't remember the name of the mountain because I was never good at that stuff. The volcano had suddenly and violently erupted, and the authorities sent in a team to save anyone they could, but all they found was that the safe zone had been completely buried in ash. It turned out to be one tragic story too many for my taste, and I told Spino how I felt. I told him I was going for a walk to clear my head. He was hesitant after my earlier encounter. Yes, I was going alone despite the danger. Yes, I knew it was a stupid thing to do. Spino certainly wasn't thrilled when I told him that I was going for a short walk, but he agreed to let me go after a short argument. I don't remember how long I'd been walking through the snow-covered forest when it happened. It might have been around 10 minutes or so when I heard brush moving nearby. The sound caused me to stop. I turned and saw several black feathered raptors, large ones at that, stick their heads up out of the snow and gaze at me with hungry eyes. It was like some horrible movie jump scare come to life. They'd just been sitting there, buried underneath the snow, I guess. This part is a little bit of a fuzzy blur, but I remember turning and sprinting through the trees as fast as I was able in my restrictive winter clothes. I remember almost running or sliding into trees, narrowly missing them for several panicked moments. But then, I ran into something immovable. A leg. I fell back onto my butt and looked up to meet the eyes of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was the second one that I'd seen in person. It was brown in color, with gray feathers covering its body. It looked at me, growling softly, the same look in its eyes that Spino has, the same gleam of intelligence, higher thinking. That's how I knew it could talk. As its growling tapered off, and then also grumbled deeply, its jaws now closed. I felt the sound vibrate through my body. The raptors, which had been chasing after me, must have felt the sound as well, because I heard them skidding through the snow to a collective stop behind me in what had to be sudden fear. Maybe they'd been just as oblivious to the presence of the silent T-Rex as I had been. The Rex then glanced up at the raptors for a moment, and it turned its eyes back to me, hissed at them unexpectedly, and motioned for me to leave. It motioned in the exact direction of my home. How did it know where I lived? I didn't ask. I just got to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I was too stunned and afraid to do anything but focus on getting home. Whatever the Rex did, it stopped the raptors from chasing me any further. I did make it home safely and told Spino what happened. Apparently that night, after I was asleep in bed, Spino went to the woods and found the Rex. They had a long talk. I don't know what about. Spino never has told me. The worst night of those early months was by far the night I had a run-in with another talking prehistoric animal. And this one ate me. Yeah, you read that right. And it was just as bad as you can imagine it was. Here's what went down. As I remember it, by this particular point, man didn't rule Earth anymore. I mean, areas such as Washington, D.C. were still more or less functioning as usual before the apocalypse. People were still doing their everyday jobs, but the further west you went across the continent, the worse things became. Being from western Ohio, I was living in the middle area between normalcy and chaos. The internet was still working where I lived, and I recall all the wild theories about what had caused everything to go wrong in the world. The wrath of God was one idea thrown around. Others said that the universe itself was glitching. Alien invasion was, of course, another theory people were adamant about. And people also blamed the government and even the space agencies of all things for the collapse of the world as we knew it. The conspiracy theories hit an all-time high for absurdity during that time. I can't say for certain, though, because I stopped paying attention once people claimed that it was higher dimensional aliens causing our global predicament. It was still winter at that point, close to Christmas, or maybe it was January. It was so hard to keep track, but the snow still covered the ground, and I remember thinking it would never melt. I'd lost track of the dates because keeping them straight was not high on my list of priorities those days. The blanket of snow on the ground was much thinner at this point, which was nice since running would be easier should I have to do so again. Spino and I had decided to make the most of all the new things that we were here to see and make the best of the cards that we'd been dealt. We'd often explore areas of the forest to see what new creatures we could find. In all honesty, it was a nice distraction. I knew things were falling apart at the seams, but living so far in the country meant that I was unaware that things were becoming worse in every major city as civilization became overwhelmed by all the new threats. People simply could not manage the change in society and the comforts they had become used to, and they packed up and left the cities. As they fled, the house of cards began to collapse around them. At that time, for Spino and I, the only thing that had changed was an increase in threats. For part of our trip that day, I rode on Spino's back because we didn't know what to expect. After a long while, we encountered no animals at all, not even a stray deer, so Spino decided it would be safe if I walked alongside him. We continued our exploring and soon found ourselves standing on the top of a large hill. Far off in the valley below, we could see the remainder of a farm, obviously long abandoned. After some more walking, we arrived and looked around. We found nothing. I thought at that moment that no one had been there in at least 50 years. The place was extremely dilapidated, especially the barn, so it was probably more. Near the house, there was a rusted hulk of a 1940s truck that was little more than a frame at this point. Also, half buried in the snow were the remains of various bits of rusted equipment scattered around the yard. There was also a frozen stream nearby, probably where those who lived here long ago got their water. We followed alongside the stream, and it led to a frozen waterfall. It was there that I suddenly sensed a weird feeling as if someone were watching us. Mino began to look around at the forest, which appeared void of any living thing. So I reached over and tapped his leg. "You feel it too?" I asked him. He nodded. His gaze didn't leave the surrounding trees. The only movement either of us saw was snow silently falling from the branches. We both quickly decided to walk back towards the barn. That eerie sensation never left us. We went back up the hill and followed Spino's tracks back to our house, leaving the old farm behind. As I recall, evening was close by the time we returned to our home. I said goodnight to Spino, and after eating a meal of flavorless noodles from a can, I went to bed. I woke later that night because something felt off. Sort of a deja vu moment. It was like the feeling I'd had the night the raptor was in the house. What I am about to share still makes me shudder when I think about it. My body fully awoke. I realized I wasn't in my bed anymore. I was next to it, lying on the floor, wrapped in the coils of a gigantic snake. I still have nightmares about it. Before I could scream, the snake tightened its coils around my body to stop my voice from escaping. "No, no, no. None of that," it hissed at me. The voice sounded like a mix between male and female, and it was odd sounding. It was hard following in the cold, and harder still to sneak in here without your giant watchdog seeing me. But I did, and here is my prize. It then hissed into my ear. "Let me go." I was able to speak out. "Once he realizes what's going on, he'll crash through the wall to get you," I told it, straining to breathe. My hand is shaking as I remember the next part of the story. "Yes, but it will be too late to save you. Don't worry. I won't crush you with my coils. I like my prey to be alive and wriggling. When it hits my stomach," Titanoboa hissed to me. His voice, so sadistic and excited, it created cold fear inside of me. So cold and scary that I still feel the same today when I remember it. I want to emphasize that this is getting very hard to write. This is not a memory I enjoy reliving. "No, not that," I begged the snake. "Oh, yes. That." That's all it said in response, before opening its maw as wide as it would go. I heard its jaw snap as it unhinged and felt a blast of scorching heat strike me. With delicate movements, clearly developed by past experiences, the gigantic snake pushed my head inside its jaws using its coil like I would my hands, past its thin, pointed teeth, and then moved its jaws behind my head. I can still feel the pinch and pull of its
teeth all along my body. It was painful. The snake began pushing me deeper into its throat. It was slow. Dear God, it was so slow. The snake paused after every swallow, and I couldn't fight back at all. The coils, the teeth, the snake's body held my arms and legs tightly. All I could do was lay there and let this horrible thing happen. It was frightening and maddening. I hope that no one else ever experiences that kind of paralyzing fear. Despite the deliberately slow actions of the Titanoboa, all too soon I was completely inside its throat. I was able to hear the muffled sound of its jaw rehinging as I slowly moved down into its thin body to the place of no return. Obviously, this snake had been able to talk, but it didn't seem to want anything from me other than to get a fresh meal. I passed out before I got to the snake's stomach, and, I really thought that was the end of me. But since I'm writing this now, you know I didn't die. I awoke after what had to just be minutes to a violent shaking as the snake was thrashed and thrown. Suddenly, a claw tore through the snake's flesh next to my head, almost cutting me open in the process. Something then seized me and pulled me out of the snake's gut. Spino lifted me out. He seemed frightened. The snake was going for the woods, he told me as he hugged me to his chest. He didn't say anything else. He just hugged me. After a moment, I returned the hug, very, very happy to be alive. Thank you, I told him. My body was shaking, but I was able to keep my voice steady as I spoke. I noticed that the sun was rising as I spoke, meaning the snake had waited most of the night before it made its move to attack me, and the early dawn light filled the woods with glorious colors. I have never seen a more beautiful sunrise since. How did it get in? I asked Spino once I stopped shaking from fright, though I then began shaking from the cold. Even though I'd calmed down, part of me hoped that Spino would never let me out of his embrace, ever. The snake found a way to open the door, Spino said to me, his breath visible in the chilly air. That news was terrific to learn. If these things, the talking creatures, could figure out how to open doors, then I knew I'd have more problems in the future. It was obvious that Spino, and the Rex that saved me, were not just flukes in this new world. How widespread would the phenomena of talking, intelligent creatures be compared to the rest throughout the anomaly that was continuously spreading like a virus across the country? I'll end this section with a closing mystery, one that the snake's own words made me think about. Winter had been set in for months, and snow and ice were in abundance. I don't understand how the Titanoboa had survived in such a cold environment. My only guess is that since the snake was one of the rare talking reborn prehistoric animals, then it was obviously not an average Titanoboa, and it likely had other secrets up its scales. The same principle goes for Spino, since he has no eel-like tail, which Spinosaurus is known to have had. And in all the videos that I'd seen of other Spinosaurus, mostly from places like the Everglades, they all had that tail. And all the ones in those internet videos were not talking ones. End of part 1. The Spinosaurus, an original post-apocalyptic story by Peyton Strange. Read for you by the author. I hope you enjoyed. I've wanted to do audio narrations for a long time, and I hope I didn't disappoint on a first attempt. Part 2 will come soon. This section is from only the beginning portion of a much longer story, with a much bigger cast of characters, good and bad, beyond Nick and Spino. That I hope to publish this year. If you are interested in following the project and hearing updates, please feel free to subscribe,
or just check back in a few months. Thank you for listening.